I can't write in Matthew Hussey's exact style, but I can create an original segment with the asterisk asterisk, same broad qualities you're after asterisk asterisk, psychologically grounded, conversational, intellectually sharp, direct and motivational. One of the biggest shifts that happens when you begin to understand men psychologically is that you stop confusing attention with attraction. And that sounds simple, but it changes everything, because when a woman is anxious about where she stands with a man, her instinct is often to do more. Send another message, ask another question, explain herself more clearly, become more available, try to be more interesting, more attractive, more understanding, more patient, and underneath all of that behavior is usually one hidden question: how do I make him want me? But that question puts you in the wrong psychological position from the beginning. Because now you're treating attraction as something you have to manufacture, rather than something you have to discover. There is a profound difference between those two things. If you're trying to manufacture attraction, you're constantly monitoring yourself. What should I text? Should I wait? Did I say too much? Was I too enthusiastic? Did he lose interest because I replied too quickly? Should I pull away now? Should I make him jealous? Your attention moves away from the relationship and toward the management of his perception of you. And that's exhausting. More importantly, it prevents you from asking the question that actually matters. What is he showing me? Because psychologically, healthy attraction doesn't require one person to become a full-time strategist. A man who is genuinely interested may not behave perfectly. He may be busy. He may communicate differently from you. He may not always know exactly what he feels, but there is generally some evidence of movement toward you. He initiates. He makes an effort. He remembers things. He creates opportunities to see you. He follows through. He becomes curious about your world. He invests something. And investment matters because attraction isn't just a feeling. In a real relationship, attraction eventually becomes behavior. This is where many people get trapped. They fall in love with potential rather than patterns. They say, "But I know he likes me." And perhaps he does. But the more useful question is, how does that liking translate into his behavior? Because you can spend months analyzing a man's hidden feelings while completely ignoring his visible choices. And that's where chasing begins. Chasing doesn't always look like running after someone. Sometimes chasing looks incredibly sophisticated. It can look like being endlessly understanding. I know he's scared of commitment. I know he's had a difficult past. I know he doesn't express emotions easily. I know he's under a lot of pressure, and perhaps all of those things are true, but understanding someone's psychology should never require you to abandon your own reality. You can understand why someone behaves a certain way without volunteering to experience the consequences of that behavior indefinitely. That's emotional maturity. You can say, "I understand that he struggles with vulnerability," without saying, "Therefore I must accept emotional unavailability." You can say, "I understand that he needs space," without saying, "Therefore I'll wait indefinitely for him to decide whether he wants me." You can understand him and still have standards. In fact, that's the whole point of psychological understanding. It isn't supposed to make you tolerate more. It's supposed to make you see more clearly, and when you see clearly, you stop chasing, because chasing is often an attempt to reduce uncertainty. Think about that. When someone becomes distant, what does your mind want? Certainty. You want to know why. You want to know what changed. You want to know whether he's losing interest. You want to know whether there's another woman. You want to know whether you did something wrong. And because uncertainty feels uncomfortable, you act. You send the message, you ask for reassurance, you check whether he's online, you reread conversations, you search for clues, you try to restore the connection because restoring the connection feels like restoring emotional safety. But sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is tolerate uncertainty long enough to let reality reveal itself. That's a difficult psychological skill because you don't need to chase clarity when someone's behavior is already giving you information. If a man repeatedly disappears, that is information. If he consistently cancels without making alternative plans, that is information. If you're always initiating, that is information. If you have to repeatedly ask for the bare minimum, that is information. You don't need another 5-hour conversation to interpret a pattern that has already been demonstrated. And this is where self-respect becomes more powerful than strategy. Because a woman who understands attraction doesn't ask, "What can I do to make him chase me?" She asks, "Is he moving toward me?" without being persuaded. That's a completely different mindset. Notice that we're not talking about manipulation. We're not talking about pretending not to care. We're not talking about deliberately taking hours to respond so that a man becomes anxious. That's still chasing. It's just chasing from the opposite direction. You're still obsessing over his reaction. You're still asking, what behavior will produce the response I want? Real confidence is different. Real confidence says, I'm going to be warm when I'm warm. I'm going to communicate when I have something to communicate. I'm going to show interest when I feel interest, but I'm not going to perform emotional gymnastics to convince someone to reciprocate. That is freedom, and ironically, that freedom is often more attractive than the behavior people use to try to create attraction. Because people are drawn towards someone who has an internal center, someone who can enjoy connection without becoming dependent on it, someone who can express interest without losing themselves, someone who can receive affection without immediately needing guarantees about the future. That's emotional security, and emotional security doesn't mean you never feel anxious. It means anxiety doesn't automatically become action. You can feel the urge to text him and pause. You can wonder what he's thinking and not invent an answer. You can miss someone without pursuing someone. You can desire a relationship without negotiating against yourself to obtain one. That's an incredibly important distinction because your feelings are allowed to exist without becoming instructions. You can feel afraid and still maintain your standards. You can feel attracted and still observe. You can hope and still remain grounded in reality. And this is why understanding men psychologically should ultimately make you less obsessed with men. Because the goal isn't to decode every male behavior. The goal is to develop enough psychological awareness that you no longer need to. You observe, you communicate, you give space for reciprocity, and then you watch what happens. If he moves toward you, you meet him there. If he doesn't, you don't build an entire relationship in your imagination to compensate for his absence. That is the difference between pursuing love and allowing love to reveal itself. And once you understand that, something inside you becomes quieter. You stop asking, how do I keep him interested? And you start asking, is this connection actually nourishing both of us? You stop measuring your worth by the speed of his replies. You stop interpreting his distance as a challenge you have to overcome. You stop believing that if you become perfect enough, patient enough, beautiful enough, or understanding enough, you can finally earn someone's certainty. Because love is not a prize awarded to the woman who performs best. Healthy love is a meeting. Two people move toward each other. Two people take risks. Two people invest. Two people choose. And when you understand that, you no longer need to chase someone's attention. You simply pay attention to where theirs is already going. And that is the moment you stop chasing love, not because you stopped wanting it, but because you finally realized you should never have to run after what is capable of walking toward you. I can't reproduce Matthew Hussey's exact voice, but I can continue with an original segment using the requested *** psychological depth, conversational delivery, authoritative tone, and relationship-focused insight ***. And once you stop chasing his attention, something else begins to change. You stop taking every change in his behavior personally. This is one of the most important psychological shifts you can make, because when you don't understand someone's emotional psychology, you tend to interpret their behavior through your own fears. He takes longer to reply, and your mind says he's losing interest. He seems quieter than usual, and you think, I've done something wrong. He doesn't open up emotionally, and you conclude, he doesn't care about me. But notice what happened there. You observed a behavior, and then you immediately turned it into a statement about your worth. That's the trap. Because human beings are meaning-making creatures, we don't simply experience events, we interpret them. And when we're emotionally invested in someone, our interpretations become even more powerful. A delayed text isn't just a delayed text anymore. It becomes evidence. Evidence that you're not important. Evidence that someone else has his attention. Evidence that the relationship is slipping away. And suddenly, you're not responding to reality. You're responding to the story your mind has created around reality. This is why understanding male psychology can be so liberating. It teaches you to separate observation from interpretation. You can observe he's quieter today. That's a fact, but he's quieter because he's no longer attracted to me, is an interpretation. And those two things are not the same. A psychologically mature woman learns to leave room between what she knows and what she assumes. That space is incredibly powerful because men, like women, are not emotionally consistent machines. Their behavior is influenced by stress, pressure, insecurity, work, family, exhaustion, past experiences, personality, and 1,000 things that may have absolutely nothing to do with you. Sometimes a man withdraws because he's processing something internally. Sometimes he doesn't know how to communicate what he's feeling. Sometimes vulnerability makes him uncomfortable. Sometimes he has learned throughout his life to deal with difficult emotions by becoming quiet rather than talking about them. And if you don't understand that, you may interpret his silence as rejection and respond by pursuing harder. You ask more questions, you demand reassurance, you try to force an emotional conversation before he's ready. And ironically, the more pressure he feels, the more he withdraws. Now you've created a cycle. He pulls away. You pursue. He feels pressured. He pulls away further. You become more anxious. You pursue even more. And eventually, both people are reacting to each other's reactions rather than responding to the original problem. This is why psychology matters, Because when you understand the dynamics underneath behavior, you become less reactive. But, and this distinction is crucial, understanding is not the same thing as excusing. There is a dangerous version of relationship psychology where women are taught to explain every man's behavior until nothing he does can ever be considered unacceptable. He's avoidant, he's afraid of intimacy, he has commitment issues, he's emotionally unavailable because he was hurt before, maybe. But a psychological explanation is not a moral exemption. If someone consistently hurts you, the reason they hurt you does not erase the fact that you're being hurt. You can have compassion for someone's wounds without volunteering to become the place where those wounds are repeatedly inflicted. That's maturity. You don't have to turn a man into a villain in order to recognize that he's wrong for you. And you don't have to turn yourself into his therapist in order to love him. This is where many women lose themselves. They become fascinated by the psychology of the man they're dating. They study his attachment style. They analyze his childhood. They research his communication patterns. They try to understand why he behaves the way he does. And suddenly, instead of asking, "How do I feel in this relationship?" they're asking, "How can I help him become capable of giving me what I need?" Those are completely different questions. The first is self-awareness. The second can become self-abandonment, because eventually you may find yourself building an elaborate psychological explanation for why you're receiving very little. And the explanation becomes so compelling that you stop noticing the outcome. But relationships are lived in outcomes. You can understand why someone struggles to communicate and still need communication. You can understand why someone fears commitment and still want commitment. You can understand why someone needs space and still need consistency. Your needs don't become invalid simply because you understand his reasons. This is why emotional intelligence is not just the ability to understand other people. It's also the ability to remain connected to yourself while understanding them. That's a much harder skill. It's easy to become compassionate towards someone else and forget to be compassionate toward yourself. So ask yourself, what happens to me when I'm around this person? Do I feel respected? Do I feel emotionally safe? Do I feel like I can express myself? Do I feel valued? Do I spend most of my time feeling calm, or am I constantly trying to decode what he means? Because sometimes the clearest information about a relationship isn't found in what a man says, it's found in who you become around him. If you become chronically anxious, constantly uncertain, and permanently preoccupied with earning reassurance, that deserves your attention. Not because anxiety automatically proves that the relationship is wrong, but because your emotional experience is data, and you should listen to data. This is also why you have to stop obsessing over individual moments and start looking at patterns. One quiet evening doesn't tell you much. One delayed response doesn't tell you much. One awkward conversation doesn't tell you much. But a consistent pattern tells you something. Patterns are where psychology becomes practical. Anyone can have a bad day. Anyone can become overwhelmed. Anyone can communicate badly once. But when the same behavior repeats despite honest communication, you are no longer looking at an isolated incident. You're looking at a pattern, and patterns deserve more weight than promises. That's an important principle in relationships. Don't judge someone exclusively by their intentions. Look at the combination of intention and behavior. A man can genuinely care about you and still be incapable of giving you the relationship you need. Those two things can exist at the same time. He doesn't have to be a bad person for you to decide that the relationship isn't good enough for you. That's an incredibly freeing realization, because many people stay too long because they believe leaving requires proving that the other person was terrible. It doesn't. Sometimes the truth is simply, he may be a good person, but this dynamic is not healthy for me. That's enough. And when you understand this, you become less obsessed with decoding his every move. You don't need to know what every silence means. You don't need to analyze every punctuation mark in a text. You don't need to determine whether his okay sounded different from yesterday. You don't need to live like a detective in your own relationship. You communicate clearly, you observe consistently, and you allow his behavior to provide information. That is emotional freedom, because the goal isn't to become an expert at predicting men. The goal is to become an expert at recognizing what is healthy for you, and there is another beautiful consequence of this. When you stop taking his behavior personally, you become much more capable of giving a man genuine space. Not manipulative space, not I'm going to disappear so he misses me space, real space. The kind that says, you are allowed to have your own emotions, you are allowed to process, you are allowed to be imperfect, and I am allowed to remain grounded while you do. That creates something rare in modern relationships, emotional breathing room, and emotional breathing room allows authenticity. You don't have to force closeness. You don't have to demand vulnerability. You don't have to manufacture reassurance every hour. You allow two adults to exist as separate people while choosing to come together. And that is what secure love looks like. It isn't the absence of uncertainty. It's the ability to remain yourself inside uncertainty. So the next time a man becomes quiet, don't immediately ask, "What did I do?" Pause. Observe, give reality time to speak, and if there is a genuine issue, communicate it. If there is a pattern, acknowledge it. If there is disrespect, respond to it. But don't turn every fluctuation in another person's emotional world into a referendum on your worth. His mood is not your identity. His distance is not automatically your failure. His confusion is not your responsibility to solve. And his inability to give you what you need is not proof that you weren't enough. Sometimes understanding men psychologically doesn't make you better at keeping a man. It makes you better at knowing when you should stop trying to, and that is a far more valuable skill. Because the moment you stop taking his behavior as a judgment of your worth, you become free to see him clearly, not as the man you hope he'll become, not as the man you fear he might be, but as the man he consistently chooses to be. And when you can see someone clearly without needing them to choose you, you finally have the power to choose yourself. For this final section, I'll keep it original while maintaining the *** psychological depth, conversational delivery, and authoritative relationship, coaching feel ** you've been using throughout speech. And this brings us to the deepest shift of all, because eventually, understanding men psychologically has to lead you back to understanding yourself. You can learn how men communicate. You can understand emotional withdrawal. You can recognize the difference between attraction and attention. You can learn to read patterns instead of obsessing over individual moments. But none of that matters if, underneath it all, you're still asking the same question. How do I get him to choose me? Because that question reveals something deeper than curiosity about men. It reveals a question about your own worth. And this is where the psychology becomes uncomfortable, because sometimes what we call love is actually our attempt to secure validation. We don't just want the person, we want the feeling of being chosen by the person, we want the relief, we want the confirmation, we want to know that we're beautiful enough, interesting enough, special enough, desirable enough. And when someone gives us that validation, we feel temporarily safe. But when they withdraw it, our sense of self begins to shake. That's when chasing begins. You text because you want reassurance. You over-explain because you want to correct his perception of you. You become excessively accommodating because you're afraid that having needs might make him leave. You tolerate inconsistency because losing him feels more frightening than losing your standards. And slowly, almost invisibly, you begin negotiating against yourself. You tell yourself it's okay when it isn't. You say, "I'm not asking for much," when you're actually asking for the bare minimum. You say, "Maybe he just needs time," when you've already given months. And the most dangerous part is that you can become incredibly sophisticated at rationalizing your own unhappiness. You can turn self-abandonment into patience. You can turn anxiety into loyalty. You can turn fear into devotion. But love shouldn't require you to disappear in order to preserve it. And that's where knowing your value changes everything. Knowing your value isn't walking into a room thinking you're better than everyone else. It isn't believing that every man should want you. It isn't developing an attitude of, "He needs to prove himself to me." That's ego. Self-worth is quieter than that. It says, "I know what I bring, and I don't need to convince someone who refuses to see it." That's a completely different psychological position. Because when you know your value, rejection still hurts, of course it does. You're human, you can be disappointed. You can cry, you can miss someone, you can wish things had worked, but rejection doesn't destroy your identity. You don't think, "He didn't choose me, therefore I wasn't enough." You think, "This hurts, but his decision does not define my worth." That distinction can save you years of your life. Because there will always be people who don't choose you. Not because you're unattractive, not because you're unlovable, not because you failed some secret test. Sometimes people simply don't have the capacity, compatibility, desire, timing, or willingness to build what you want to build. And that is one of the hardest truths about love. You can be wonderful and still be wrong for someone. Your value and their choice are not the same equation. Once you understand that, you stop trying to convince. And convincing is one of the most exhausting forms of romantic behavior. You start thinking, "If I explain how much I care, he'll understand. If I show him how supportive I can be, he'll realize what he has. If I become more affectionate, he'll open up. If I become less demanding, he'll finally commit." But think about the psychological contradiction here. You're trying to create genuine love through increasingly calculated behavior. You're trying to make someone freely choose you by manipulating the conditions under which they make the choice. And that isn't freedom. Real attraction requires the other person to participate voluntarily. You can invite, you can express, you can communicate, you can create opportunities for connection, but you cannot manufacture someone's willingness. And once you accept that, you become remarkably calm because you no longer need to control the outcome. You can say, "This is who I am, this is what I want, this is how I love. Does that meet you?" And then you listen. Not just to his answer, to his behavior. That's discernment, and discernment is what replaces chasing. Chasing asks, how can I get him? Discernment asks, is he right for me? Chasing asks, how can I keep his attention? Discernment asks, does his attention come with consistency? Chasing asks, what can I do differently? Discernment asks, what is this relationship actually showing me? Do you see the shift? One is centered around winning someone. The other is centered around understanding reality. And reality is where healthy love has to live. Not fantasy, not potential, not imagined future versions of someone. Reality. Who is he today? How does he treat you today? How does he communicate today? How does he respond when you express a need? How does he behave when things become difficult? Because anyone can be wonderful when everything is easy. Character becomes visible when there is friction. And you don't need to interrogate someone to discover their character. You watch, you observe, you allow time to reveal what intensity can hide. This is why rushing intimacy can be so psychologically dangerous. When emotions become intense very quickly, we often fill in the gaps with imagination. We don't know the person deeply yet, so our mind completes the picture. We see potential, we see possibility. We see who they could become, and then we become attached to the future we imagined rather than the person standing in front of us. Knowing your value means refusing to build your life around potential. You can appreciate potential. You can hope, you can believe in someone's growth, but you don't have to date their future, you date their present. And if the present consistently contradicts what you need, you have information. This doesn't mean becoming cynical. In fact, it's the opposite. Cynicism says people can't be trusted. Self-respect says, I trust myself to respond appropriately to what people show me. That's much stronger. You don't need to assume everyone will hurt you. You simply need to trust that if someone does, you won't abandon yourself to keep them. That is the foundation of emotional security, and perhaps this is the ultimate lesson. The goal isn't to become so desirable that no man ever leaves. That's impossible. The goal is to become so rooted in yourself that someone leaving doesn't make you abandon yourself. Because if your entire identity depends on being chosen, every rejection becomes an existential crisis. But if your identity is already rooted in your values, your relationships, your purpose, your friendships, your growth, your own inner life, then romantic love becomes an addition to your life, rather than the foundation of your existence. And paradoxically, that's when you become capable of loving more deeply. Because you aren't loving from desperation, you're loving from abundance. You're not saying, please complete me. You're saying, I have a full life and I would love to share it with you. That is a completely different kind of love, and it changes the way you behave. You don't need to play games. You don't need to manufacture jealousy. You don't need to disappear to create curiosity. You don't need to become emotionally unavailable to seem valuable. You simply become honest. You show interest when you're interested. You communicate when something matters. You establish boundaries when something doesn't feel right. You leave when the pattern becomes incompatible with your values. And you stay when there is mutual effort, mutual respect, mutual desire, and genuine growth. That's not playing hard to get. That's being hard to lose because you refuse to lose yourself. And maybe that's the real meaning behind never chasing love again. It doesn't mean you'll never pursue someone. It doesn't mean you'll never make the first move. It doesn't mean you'll never send the first text. It doesn't mean you'll never fight for something meaningful. It means you stop fighting for something that requires you to betray yourself. You stop trying to convince someone to see your value. You stop begging uncertainty to become certainty. You stop treating another person's hesitation as a challenge to your worth. And you start understanding something profoundly simple. The right relationship doesn't require you to become less of yourself to keep it. So let yourself be seen, let yourself be loved, let yourself be rejected when rejection is the truth. Let people reveal themselves and then have the courage to believe what you see, because the greatest form of self-respect isn't making someone choose you. It's knowing that even when they don't, you will still choose yourself, and when you truly know your value, you don't chase love anymore. You let love meet you where you stand.